All right, we're coming back with another Tanya share, another little bit of a deep dive into something interesting in the week's Tanya. And this week, there's a lot of going on. It's a lot of chapters. It's, I think, 5 chapters, which I'm not sure if it's the full record for how many chapters you can squeeze into a week, but relatively short chapters, not like it's a particularly long Tanya, although there are a few long days. Anyhow, I digress. I think let's just get into it. And I kind of went back and forth about 2 different ideas for this week. So if I have time, then at the end, I'll try to get into the idea that was pushed to the back burner. The reason why it was pushed to the back burner is because it has what to do with Hilchos Talmud Torah. And I feel like we've spent a lot of time in Hilchos Talmud Torah, and I want to try to keep this in understanding a little bit of a deeper aspect in Tanya by trying to nitpick nuance that's going on. And trying to give some more background in the Alter Rebbe's reasoning and his thought process, more so than just trying to turn this into the Hilchos Talmud Torah share that's disguised as Tanya share, because that isn't the intention over here. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, there is an interesting letter in Iggeres Hakodesh, and it's the last one, and it's which is that the Alter Rebbe is benching people that give tzedakah, and he's saying they should keep on giving tzedakah, and says, and he goes on a little bit of a discussion about how essentially when a person gives tzedakah, they cause to some extent revelation of light, but it's not now, it's from Mashiach, Sefer Kolman, and he goes on a little bit about this prose, and then he says that what's the vessel for this light of Hashem? So he says the vessel for this light of Hashem is the attribute of kindness and giving, the givingness that a person has to be able to give to someone that doesn't have from their own. And to this end, he says, he quotes the Tikkunim that Kamaguf and Tekinas, that there's different organs that Hashem established for different things, and he says Chesed Yamino, that Chesed is the right arm. And then he says that there's a concept that the entire body is included in the right side. This concept is discussed in Zohar in a few places. And then he says, V'kach amar Payet levush tzedakah. This is what the poet said. Payet and poet are actually related words in their etymology. But a paitan is essentially someone that wrote poems, and particularly refers to someone that wrote liturgical poems which are recited during davening, during prayers. And so he says, this is what the poet said. What the poet said is levushe tzedakah, that his garment is righteousness. So essentially, we have something a little bit funny going on over here. And the funny thing is that he's going here, he's building up this idea, he's quoting Zohars and this and that. He quotes a letter that he wrote at some previous point. He says the letter that we had before, and you can pay attention to that because that's going to come back as Hashem at some point. But after this, and he brings the Zohar and Chesed Yamina, and then Yamin is Nichlal, and everything is Nichlal and Yamin, everything is included in the right side, which is an established concept in Kabbalah. But he says that the poet says, you got it. This is the poet. The poet says that Levush tzedakah. Now, something going on over here, because the idea that the Alter Rebbe is quoting a poet in a parak of Tanya seems to be a little bit off. Why would the Alter Rebbe be quoting a poet in the middle of a parak of Tanya? Who is this poet? What poem is this? And what's going on over here? The Alter Rebbe felt compelled that his argument wasn't enough. He had to pull up the fact that some poet backs him up. I hope that wasn't disrespectful to whoever the poet is, but it's something that I think needs an understanding, needs a little bit of clarification. So, I think that's what we're going to focus on a little bit today. I don't know how long it's going to take. Hopefully not too long. I am somewhat in a time crunch, but no focus on that. Just focus on what's going on over here. So, in general, there is a lot of conversation that is had about poems in liturgy, in davening. So, the Alter Rebbe did write a Shulchan Aruch, and in his Shulchan it's actually interesting that we have a siman about poetry in davening. And when we look at it, it's actually funny. And this is going to be, I'll point it out right now, this is going to be a thread throughout this entire shiur, that in general, rabbis were anti-poetry. That is to say, anti-liturgical poetry. Anti-poetry is actually, there happens to be in Submission Zion, in Archaim, that people kind of put down poetry as being like a Moshe Leitzim, I'm sure that there's some kind of fancy English translation that I'm not fully aware of, but it essentially means like a gathering of scoffers, and it's something that people advise to stay away from, kind of. But yeah, anyhow, in the Torah, I don't really know that there's siman titles in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, but at least in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the way that they frame the siman is siman samachas in Archaim, and it's to not interrupt davening with piyutim, and that's what the title of the siman is, and that should give maybe a little bit of an idea about how the rabbis felt about piyutim. Although, to be fair, it's not necessarily the case. There is actually, there are recorded cases of printers putting their own opinions into the chapter headings in Shulchan Aruch. But that's beside the point. It is at least some kind of slight insight. So, the Alter Rebbe, at least in his, from his point of view, he's writing that there are a lot of places that they have a minhag to say piyutim in Kriyas Shema. Now, it should be noted, which Alter Rebbe doesn't know, it's not my chiddush at all, that saying a piyut in Kriyas Shema is a little bit more difficult, halachically, than to say a piyut in Shemona Esrei. And the reason why is because in Shemona Esrei, we're actually allowed to add in whatever we want. That it says, for example, a person has a sick person that they're trying to daven for, they can daven for them in the bracha of Reif Yichelim. Every bracha, you're able to add in some part of the bracha, like something similar to the bracha that you're saying. So you're davening for Parnasa, you're allowed to daven in Mevarach Hashanim. You're davening for Mashiach, you're allowed to say it in Kabbalah Shefer. For justice, Shiur Shetenu. All of these are just random examples, but ultimately, in every bracha, you're allowed to add in from the bracha itself. So when these poets are coming and they're adding in piyutim, they're adding in poetry to different brachas from Esrei, every time that they do that, they're adding in only something that is similar to the bracha, that may in the bracha. It's not the words that the Chachamim dictated should be in the bracha, but they're giving it more flair, they're giving it more pizzazz, they're giving it more prose and poetry. So they add in massive poems, but always it gets back to the original point. So in Shemona Esrei, it's actually fine. In Kriyas Shema, it's actually a debate. And the reason why this debate exists is because you shouldn't be, not necessarily do you have the ability to add in. There's a line that the Chachamim say that in a place where the Chachamim said to be short, you shouldn't lengthen, and people say this is a violation of that. The idea of adding in parts of davening is, anyhow. So as far as Kriyas Shema goes, it is actually interesting, and we should take another step back, and we should point out that the brachas of Kriyas Shema that we say nowadays are seemingly longer than the Chachamim originally established. How it is that things got to be universally accepted about the brachas of Kriyas Shema that we say nowadays is a long story, which I am not intimately familiar, and I cannot say that I can give that over in a share right now, because I didn't do enough research into how exactly. I do know that there are a lot of parts of brachas of Kriyas Shema that got added in by the Goyim. I don't know exactly how those won universal acceptance, and that maybe it's just one of the mysteries of life. I'm not 100% sure. It's another idea of the bracha of Hanisin Li'av Kayach, that somehow it's a bracha established by the Goyim, which people in general are pretty against. At least people in my circles. I'm close with the people in other circles where they totally say the bracha is that the Goyim established without even hesitating. But in general, at least Alter Rebbe seems to frown on it. But then comes the bracha of Hanisin Li'av Kayach, and that one managed to get away with it. The full bracha that we say in the morning, we counted towards Meir brachas. But it's a bracha that's established for the Goyim. You have certain opinions that it wasn't the Gemara, just in different girsayos. That's how it got its acceptance. But ultimately, my point is that we in general try to leave out things from the Ge'inim, Birchas Kriyas Shema, certain words got mentioned in, and I do think that ultimately the idea of adding in piyotim in Kriyas Shema is not the end of the world, halachically, but you definitely have this anti-piyah sentiment. And the Alter Rebbe says, he concludes in regards to this, it's not a good idea. And you see that the complaints that people are actually bringing is that it gives people the opportunity to start talking in middle of davening. And I want to finish the idea, and we'll get to this. We'll continue this idea of the disturbance in the middle of davening a little bit later, as Hashem. There's so much going on, and I'm trying to keep it a little bit organized. But just hold on to that thought. Hold on to the thought that it has what to do with Dvar Matil in the middle of davening. Ultimately, the Alter Rebbe says that it's not something that needs to be protested because there's what to rely on. But ultimately, someone that doesn't say them, they're not missing anything out. It should be noted that in Chabad, we do not say any piyotim in middle of Birchas Kriyas Shema. Not something that ever comes up. But there are a lot of shuls where they do say piyotim in middle of Kriyas Shema on special days, special occasions. Now, in this conversation, it should be noted there is actually a certain idea that's expressed over here, which is very interesting, and this is the main reason why I'm bringing out the siman, even though there are a lot of other points that I'm planning on getting back to from the siman B'ez Hashem, but at least for the general aspect, there's one particular reason why I'm bringing down the siman, which is that there's a reference to someone named Rabbi Iggeres Hakodesh, which anyone's familiar with piyotim is almost certainly familiar with his name. I don't consider myself to be so familiar with piyotim, but at least Rabbi Iggeres Hakodesh, I do know. I've also heard of Yanai, but yeah, Rabbi Iggeres Hakodesh, and the Alter Rebbe brings an interesting proof from him, and he says that essentially I can prove to you that it's fine to say piyotim. And what's the proof? The proof is that Rabbi Iggeres Hakodesh wrote piyotim. You might say, okay, a big whoop, but no. The Alter Rebbe says, and this is his lashon, that Rabbi Eliezer of Hakodesh, he was a Tana. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing because I'm saying it in English, but he's from Eretz Yisrael, from Kiryas Sefer, and in his days they were Mekadesh the moon based on a Re'iyah. Before the calendar was fully established, fully kicked in. However, it is ultimately witnesses would come to Beis Din and they would say, we saw the new moon, and Beis Din would say, okay, so then the new month is Mekodesh, and then that way they would establish Rosh Chodesh based on that. So when you're living in such a situation, you live close enough to Eretz Yisrael, you live close enough to Yerushalayim, I should say, which is where the Beis Din HaGadol sat and they established Rosh Chodesh. If you live close enough, practically speaking, you would almost always have only one day of Yom Tov. The reason being because, practically speaking, you don't have any doubt the witnesses are going to come out based on whatever they come, as in the runners are going to come out based on the witnesses. So, Rabbi Eliezer Hakodesh, he lived in the times that they were establishing based on the Re'iyah. They were establishing based on the citing of the witnesses. So, the Alter Rebbe says Rabbi Eliezer Hakodesh is Tana. He's from the generation where I'm going to get back to this usage of the word Tanya, of the word Tana B'ez Hashem shortly, but he was a Tana. He lived in such a time and in such a place where that's how they were establishing the Re'iyah. So he says that seeing as Rabbi Eliezer Hakodesh is such an early source, or such a great source, we'll get back to that as Hashem, but he says, therefore, the fact that he didn't establish any piyotim in Shemona Esrei for the second day of Rosh Hashanah should demonstrate to you, or for the second day of Yom Tov, I believe the second day of Yom Tov, it's a long story, but just to take it at face value, you didn't establish for the second day, whatever the second day is. So, essentially, if you have a poem, and it's just Rabbi Eliezer Hakodesh, and it's inserted into the middle of davening, you definitely see that his opinion was that you're able to insert a poem into the middle of davening. And so that should be a reason why you're able to insert poems into the middle of davening. Now, this is Varj is made about Shemona Esrei particularly. Whether it applies to Kriyas Shema is another conversation. Ultimately, you do have people and they're inserting poems into Kriyas Shema, and the people at the Chachamim of the Rishonim, they still have their problems with it. But that is that. Now, it's actually funny. It's not particularly funny, but it's funny if you're me, maybe, that people look at this and they say, if this is what the Alter Rebbe says, and certainly the Alter Rebbe holds, that Rabbi Eliezer Hakodesh is a Tana, because, to quote the Alter Rebbe, Tanahu, he's a Tana. So this is something that actually got a lot of controversy. Not a lot of controversy, but a lot of people disagreeing. And the reason why is because Rabbi Eliezer Hakodesh, we're pretty sure, lived somewhere in like the 600s, the 700s of the Common Era. I would say about 200 years after the completion of the Gemara, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And there seems to be a lot backing this up. Now, it's actually interesting if you go and you take a look at the Alter Rebbe sources. I think that it's actually very enlightening. Other than his sources on the Shulchan Aruch, it's actually very enlightening in seeing that I don't actually think that the Alter Rebbe thought that Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh was a Tana from the Tanakh era, living pre or slightly post destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. That is to say, within the first century of the Common Era, a few hundred years before the completion of the Talmud. I don't think that the Alter Rebbe thought that. And I'll try to back myself up. The Alter Rebbe quotes two sources for his assertion that, Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh, everything that he is, and this idea that we should be trusting Piyutim because Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh himself wrote some. So there are three main sources, I would say, for this idea. You have the Rashba, who lived roughly at the same time as the Rosh, who is another source, and you also have the Torah, who is the son of the Rosh. So those are the, I would say, major sources in solid Rishonim. Now, the first thing I think to be bringing out is that the Alter Rebbe references both the Rosh and the Torah, and usually the Alter Rebbe, there are exceptions to the rule in Ahin and Her. Usually, I don't want to start talking about usually and starting to establish a bunch of rules about how the Alter Rebbe does things, but ultimately, the Alter Rebbe doesn't try to bring Makaris just to flex to you that he knows Makaris. I'm not sure if I made this point before, but it's something that the Alter Rebbe typically doesn't do. So you have the Torah, and the Torah essentially quotes other people. He quotes the Rosh, and it doesn't really make sense that the Alter Rebbe should be quoting the Torah and the Rosh. If your main source is the Rosh, just quote the Rosh. So that's a little bit of a question. We also would need to understand why the Alter Rebbe completely left out the Rashba. By the way, the Rashba is a champion of the idea that the Hakodesh, Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh, is a Tana. But it seems that the Alter Rebbe actually wanted to say like this. The Torah doesn't say that Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh is a Tana. He just says that he's from earlier generations, and so therefore his decision to put Piyutim into Shemoneh Esrei has some kind of gravitas. But the Torah doesn't say anything about him being a Tana. The Rosh brings two ways of looking at it. The Rosh says, essentially word for word what the Alter Rebbe says. I should say the Alter Rebbe says almost word for word what the Rosh says. But what he leaves out is something very interesting. He says, the Rosh says that there are those that say that he's a Tana, and it says in the Psikta that there's a Psikta that says, I'm forgetting the exact lashon of the Psikta, but that essentially he's Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, that is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, so he's fully from that generation. So that opinion quoted by the Rosh is very much of the opinion that Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh is like a full-on Tana living in like a relatively early generation, going back to basically before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So the thing is that the Alter Rebbe actually doesn't quote these two parts that would point to him being actually a Tana. And he actually blends the two opinions in the Rosh. The Rosh says that Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh, a great guy, and he wrote Piyutim Shemoneh Esrei. Then he says, Yeshayimim, there are those that say that he's a Tana. But not that he's actually, not that these two opinions are the same. He has his authority simply because he's a great guy. The Yeshayimim, there are those that say he's a Tana, and that's a side point that he's to bring out the earliness of his generation. That this has been around for a long time. So the Alter Rebbe seems to be trying to take the wording of the Rosh. It's a good wording, and he wants to emphasize the greatness of Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh. But that being said, when he takes out the Yeshayim that he's a Tana, and he takes out the reference to the Psikta, which would have him being like actually fully a Tana, I would say that the Alter Rebbe is actually trying to bring out a point that he agrees primarily with the Torah. The Torah isn't making any claims about Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh being a Tana. The Rashba is completely not able to be brought over here because the Rashba is fully of the opinion that Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh is a Tana. The Rosh is maybe yeah, maybe no. So Alter Rebbe quotes the lashon of the Rosh to bring out the point of the greatness of Rebbe Eliezer Hakodesh. But that being said, when it comes to him being a Tana, he's not going to leave that part out, but he's going to say that he's a Mandamar. Now, my extra theory in this would be that the word Tana when it actually came to start being used to refer to that particular generation, that is to say the generation of the Mishnah and earlier. I don't think that the Alter Rebbe necessarily meant that he's actually a Tana in that sense. I think that the word Tana literally means one that teaches. And Amera literally means the guy that chazers, the guy that reviews it. He's saying it over. Typically, you would have, and this is how it's used in the Gemara, that a Tana is someone that teaches a Mishnah. He's the guy that he sits in the class, and he's the one making the statements. And that's what a Tana is. Now, it does happen to be that in the generation of post-Mishnah, I'm going to try to refer to it by when the generation was and not the term, because we're trying to avoid the terms. But in the post-Mishnah generation, they were essentially Ameras, because they were just repeating a Mishnah when they sat in the class, or they were repeating a brayta, whatever it is that they were repeating. But because you had the guy in the top of the class, and he's the guy that's saying the main statement, he's the guy that you can't argue with, because he's the one, he's quoting the Mishnah. So because of that, you call that guy the Tana. And this is common very much throughout Gemara, to refer to such a person as a Tana, because they are making a statement that you cannot argue with. They're an authority figure. They're bringing forth the law. An Amira is a person that he typically repeats the speech of the Rosh Yeshiva. And this is something that I haven't seen any reference to in Mishnah, but in the Gemara it comes up in a few places that this is what an Amira is. And it's a role that essentially you're the guy that's repeating the speech. Now, it does happen to be, there are some stories where speeches were altered or changed, different answers were given to questions. That's not the point. The point is ultimately, it's not about the authority of the Amira, I think. I think that the main point is that when you have the Rosh Yeshiva and he's giving a drasha, you hear it from the Amira, you hear it from the person that's calling it out, and in theory, you can argue. He's someone in your generation, he's making his own vart, and so he's an Amira, and you're able to argue. I think that this is the real usage of the words, and kind of as a placeholder, and I haven't yet narrowed down and located where exactly the usage of Tana and Amira started applying to the generation of the Mishnah versus the later generation. But that being said, it's not at all a stretch to say that a Tana is essentially saying someone is an authority figure. They are a man Amar on their own. And Vichlal, the idea even in the Alter Rebbe generation, we know that people were using Tana to mean this, and the proof, I think, is the commonly quoted idea that they said about Alter Rebbe, that he is Tana u Polig. That they said about him that he's a Tana, he's able to argue. What does it mean that he's a Tana, he's able to argue? You think that they meant that the Alter Rebbe is able to argue with the Mishnah? I think that idea is a little bit ludicrous. If you would say that, then all of the arguments against Chassidim would kind of fall away. Or you would say that the Chassidim are being kafrim because they're saying that you could argue with Mishnah. However you want to slice it, ultimately, I think that when they said Tana Polig, what they're saying is that Alter Rebbe is a man Amar. He's not just someone that repeats statements of others. He is a Tana. He is an opinion in his own right, and he has the weight of an opinion that he's able to argue with his peers. We don't just say that he's someone that's parroting other people's opinions. So all of this is about Rebbe Eliezer Color. All of this, ultimately, this is what it's about. The Rebbe Eliezer Color, seemingly, I think we've established, at least in my opinion, we've established Alter Rebbe doesn't think that he is a Tana. That is to say from the Tanaic era, but he is a Tana that he has strong opinions, and we're able to quote him as a significant man Amar in the Ge'inim. He lived in that era. So the thing is that we see the Alter Rebbe has this kind of respect for Rebbe Eliezer Color, regardless of what generation he lived in. And Rebbe Eliezer Color is a Python. He is writing piyutim. So if we would say that this piyut is written by Rebbe Eliezer Color, I think in a certain sense we'd be able to close up shop. Rebbe Eliezer Color is essentially someone that he's from the Ge'inim. He said Livosh Tzedakah. Remember, that's what this is about. He said Livosh Tzedakah, and therefore we're fine. We're able to just leave it alone. However, I wish I could say that I know that that's the case. I don't really know who wrote this piyut. This piyut is a piyut that I think is famous, at least in Chabad, and it's a piyut of Atu Alikenu, and it's said on Rosh Hashanah, in Shachris, I think at the beginning of the Kedusha, at the beginning of the third bracha of Shemini Esrei, if I'm remembering correctly, that's where it's placed. It's towards the beginning in all of the speeches that we're making in the piyutim, which is another fascinating topic about how we ended up getting to where we got to in regards to what piyutim we put in. That being said, this piyut is not a piyut that is so particularly well known. It is something that did exist in these of the Rishonim, this piyut of Atu Halikinu Bashmayim Ba'aretz, and essentially it's a piyut that it goes through a bunch of different things that are ascribed to Hashem. He's Dalgal Merivavav, Husach Vayayi, Tivin Ivro, kind of rolls off the tongue, and it's ordered according to the Aleph Beis. I think a very fun poem to say, and to a certain extent, it's also one that I think the Chazan almost skips through. That is to say, you often don't see like a slow tune for this piyut. I think the Chazan is trying to save his voice for Nisan Tekif maybe, but ultimately, I digress. It's not a particularly common piyut, or at least it wasn't in those days. There were people saying it, there were people not saying it. I don't know what it is involved to be saying it. I haven't, actually, it's not too long ago since I davened with Pesachim on Rosh Hashanah, but ultimately I wasn't paying attention to if they were saying this piyut or not. At the end of the day, it is a piyut, and seemingly we do not know who authored this piyut. I haven't found it, and I wouldn't venture to guess because there's a lot that goes into these things, and it's a harder piyut to pin down because the wording is basically lifted from Tanakh one way or another, so it's not like anyone is putting in their own words or their own style. It's just based on Aleph Beis, bringing out different attributes of Hashem based on quotes from Tanakh. So, seeing as we don't know the author, the idea of pinning it on someone like Rabbi Eliezer Koller is seemingly out of the question. That's besides for the point of would the Alter Rebbe actually pin it on Rabbi Eliezer Koller, but you can argue at least that someone like Rabbi Eliezer Koller, of his stature, that if he says something, it's got to be. So, I think we'll go on a little bit to discussing how the Alter Rebbe relates to these piyutim and other works, and then we're going to circle back, B'ezras Hashem, to the idea, or a few ideas about why it is that I think that the Alter Rebbe was quoting this line from a Python, and he wasn't satisfied with whatever he wrote before. So, in Likutei Torah and Torah, there are actually a lot of mentions of piyutim. I'm not going to say that it's as common as, Tehillim, but it does come up a decent amount of times. This isn't just my thought process. There are agais for Likutei Torah. I'm not sure to what extent the Rebbe had involvement in that. I believe a great extent, but I'm not 100% sure. But ultimately, there are hagais, and they very directly say that it is referring to piyutim. One interesting anecdote, I think, is that there is a piyut, which is v'chol ma'aminim. Everyone is familiar with it. But that being said, there is a discussion that goes around about if it's actually v'chol ma'aminim, or if the title of the poem should really be Iggeres Hakodesh v'chol ma'aminim shu kelamuna, and it would essentially matter, do you read it with v'chol ma'aminim being the beginning of a stanza, or the latter half of a stanza. Ultimately, in these aris, it kind of switches between both of them. There is at least one mention where it says that it refers to the poem as Iggeres Biad Midas Mishpat. So, that's just one interesting point. You do have this Vart of Levushei Tzedakah quoted. You have the piyut of Yigdal is very often quoted. It's almost impossible to daven with me in Amos Sagdash Shol and not have me point out that the Alter Rebbe quotes Yigdal all the time, even though we personally don't say it. The Alter Rebbe didn't put it into his siddur. If it was in a machzor, if the Alter Rebbe even had a machzor, that's a whole other conversation, a massive can of worms that I feel like I've already opened enough cans of worms in regards to the piyutim. But you have that. You have this idea. So you have the idea of piyutim being quoted in Chassidus, and they're quoted all the time, relatively all the time. The v'hu mos ve'niguf is a line from Yigdal, and that comes up definitely a lot in Chassidus. There are references it also. Now, there is one quote over here that references something to get back to the Levushei Tzedakah, but I think it's kind of the anti-Levushei Tzedakah, not the anti-Levushei Tzedakah, but it's the other thing to be pointed out, the counterpoint to Levushei Tzedakah, and that is Alter Rebbe references in a mimer on Rosh Hashanah, actually, fitting enough. He references another piyut, it is a piyut, it's just the Yetzer. Get to that in a second, and the Yetzer says Biyud Levushim Lavash Kadosh Baruch Hu, something like that. Now, this line is from what's called Yetzer, as I mentioned. That is from one of the poems that were written for Kriya Shema, because it's for the bracha Yetzer. And there's a lot of different titles for all different kinds of piyutim, and this isn't, I guess this is turning into a shiur on piyutim to some extent, but no, we are trying to focus on the Alter Rebbe and his opinions. Ultimately, though, the Alter Rebbe quotes this verse of Yud Levushim, that with 10 Levushim Hashem enclothed himself. Now, in the notes for the Likutei Torah, it says that this line is not exactly as it says in the Medrash. To be fair, there's enough Midrashim and enough Gersais, whatever I have found in Medrash, but essentially there's some Gersais and Medrash that have it as 7 Levushim, which kind of makes sense when you read the paragraph that's brought in the Medrash, and essentially says that there are 10 or 7 Levushim that Hashem wore. 3 of them are doubles, that it just says 2 things that are next to each other. So that's one easy way that you can imagine that there are certain Gersais that say 7. Ultimately, though, the Python says that it's 10, and it is suggested in the notes on Likutei Torah that the Alter Rebbe might have been referring to this piyut. Now, regardless of how you want to slice it, this medrash is still existing, and in this medrash, it says that the levush of levush tzedakah is not really standalone levush, because it says v'yilbash tzedakah Syrian, which, by the way, this is what this is all getting to the idea of v'yilbash tzedakah Syrian and contrasting it. We are hopefully going to have at least a little bit of a chassidish verstand in the shiur, but you have v'yilbash tzedakah Syrian ukei shiur b'reishay, and it says that this is 2 harishayim harei I forget the exact lashon, but yeah, you have two levushim, and they're stuck to each other. Now, not only that, but you have a bunch of other levushim that are quoted over here. You have all of the levushim that Hashem is wearing. This is, I believe, the levush that Hashem wears to take down Yavon, to take down Greece. But there's a lot of other levushim. The first levush that he wore was Hayid and Hadar and Eiz, and Hashem is wearing a lot of levushim. So, seemingly, the idea of quoting that sort of levushim would be in contrast, as in, that is to say, to quote the idea of Vayilbash tzedakah Syrian. Now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think that at the beginning of the shiur I mentioned that there's another pasuk that the Alter Rebbe has made use of before, to bring out the advantages of tzedakah. Yeah, there is that pasuk. It is brought in the 3rd chapter of Iggeres Hakodesh, and the Alter Rebbe has a whole pilpul over there about it, which we'll get into contrasting them soon, B'ez Hashem. But ultimately, that was part of the question that I think I just completely forgot to mention, which is, why not quote the pasuk? Why quote the poem? But ultimately, yeah, you have v'yilbash tzedakah Syrian. That being said, v'yilbash tzedakah Syrian, to kind of answer the question, seems to be that it's not a standalone levush. It seems to be that it's working with a lot of other things. So, yeah, that's essentially the point. Now, I do want to just kind of diverge for 1 second to talk about one more point, which I think ultimately is going to lead into some other points, and then we'll get back to B'ez Hashem. But that point is that we see actually other people having the greatest access to piyutim. So we'll go through a few examples and see maybe a lesson that we could pull from it, and then try to tie everything together. I'm noticing how long this recording is going for, and we're going to try to make it quick, B'ez Hashem. So, the first person I'll say from my childhood is Rashi. Rashi on Parshas Vayetze, it says that Hashem remembered Rachel. She was hated, but Hashem remembered her. He opened her womb, and so Rashi says that this is actually reminiscent of, this is as the Python established, as the poet established, that it says essentially that Rachel was afraid because Esav heard that she had no kids. This is one interpretation of what the piyut actually means. There's a lot of commentaries on Rashi you can see over there, but that Esav heard that Rachel didn't have any kids, and as such he thought, okay, maybe Yaakov is going to divorce her, because that's the halacha, that if a person is married to a woman for 10 years, then halachically there's an idea to divorce her if she doesn't have any kids, and so she was freaking out. Now, anyhow, the point is that Rashi quotes this piyut in his commentary on Torah. Now, it's Rashi's commentary on Torah halachic, not necessarily, not particularly. It's something that people would quote if it gave them a raya, and if it didn't give them a raya, people would say, yeah, it's just Rashi's Pshat Shel Mikra. It's not really. The Rashi does seem to quote things not halachically, just to give Pshat Shel Mikra. So it is taka, not an ultimate proof. But the point is that Rashi is quoting these piyutim in a somewhat in a Torah context. It's not just, he's not looking at it as just someone wrote a poem about something. He's saying, no, there's actually something to it. This is a purish on Torah. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I could be mistaken, I'm not an expert in these things, but if I'm not mistaken, this is from a poem that is written by Rabbi Iggeres Hakodesh. It's part of the Yisur of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which, as we mentioned before, Rabbi Iggeres Hakodesh did write for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So I do believe that it is from him. Regardless, that's just one example of Rishonim are actually quoting these piyutim as an understanding in Torah, not just a poem. I would say probably the foremost idea where there's a lot of rhetoric about piyutim is the piyut of Merum Tzarchei Amcha, and this same thing would apply to Machnis Rachmim, Chnis Rachaminu. Essentially, the halachic idea of, are you allowed to ask angels for things? Are you allowed to make requests of angels? And there's a lot of rhetoric in the Rishonim about this. Ultimately, in Chabad, it's actually interesting because it seems like we've gone kind of to both sides. Tzemach Tzedek in his youth seemed to hold that it is problematic. I believe he said this in either Mitzvah Samana Salikos or Mitzvah Tefillah. But ultimately, he seemed to backtrack, and there's a whole interesting idea that I heard about maybe it was Chov of the Mari Bruno, that a different understanding, etc., etc. Ultimately, my point is that people are discussing these piyutim in a halachic context. There is something which someone that reads the Siddur more might have more of an appreciation of, but essentially it is that it says in the piyutim for Ne'ilah, it says Hayim Yifna Hashem Hashem Yifna Navay Sharacha, or something to that effect. I'm not looking at it right now, so I might be misquoting. But essentially it says that the day is turning and the sun is also. And so this is an interesting point, which is brought out by the Bach. I would imagine that there might have been people that spoke about it before the Bach, but the Bach is at least one early source about this, that the Python, not the Python, we're going to talk about the Bach first. The Bach says that essentially we should try to say this before we get to the end of sunrise, the end of sunset, which is to say nightfall. We should try to say this line before nightfall. There is a discussion in Maseches Yoma about when is the proper time for Ne'ilah, and there's a machlekes of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. And Rav says that it is when the gates of heaven close, and Rabbi Yochanan says it's when the gates of the Beis Hamikdash close. So essentially, according to Rav, the gates of the heavens could close a little bit later. So you can push it off after Shkia. That is not to say that you should start after Shkia, but that you have the ability to finish Ne'ilah after Shkia, and not only after Shkia, but after taste, no problem. Because the gates of heaven could close a little bit later. The gates of the Beis Hamikdash, however, have a pretty set closing time, and that is by Shkia, and so, that is by nightfall. And so according to Rabbi Yochanan, that is when you're supposed to make sure that you are done your davening. And there's what discussion to be had about what exactly the parameters of the time are, but in Kamakemi. The point is that certainly according to Rabbi Yochanan, you got to be finished by taste. You can't just continue Ne'ilah that long. Now, the thing is that as time goes on, people keep on adding more and more to Shemon Esrei. They keep on adding more and more piyutim, so things get dragged out with sliches and with piyutim, etc., etc. So, there's actually an interesting anecdote that the Rosh got up and started davening Musaf on his own when the tzibur was taking too long with the time, because even though a person is able to daven Musaf all day, they're supposed to do it by the 7th hour, and he saw the time was getting longer. And this is a very important piece of halacha, actually, the idea of davening without a minyan if the time for davening is passing. And it seems that to a very large extent we get this actually from the story of the Rosh, that even for Musaf, he's going to daven without a minyan. But the point is that you see there's a certain frustration with the time going on. So now the Bach says, he's talking about the time, and he says that practically speaking, the minhag is people take Ne'ilah and they run with it. They go for as long as it takes. And it's understandable, it's a very potent and very powerful time. And so he says it seems like we hold like Rav, even though there's a big discussion at the Rishonim, and Lavdafka, would we say that you should paskin like that, just in our regular rules? But the Bach says, leave it be. That's how people are doing it. But he says, the line, Hayim Yifna, certainly that you should make sure that you say it before taste, because you're saying Hayim Yifna, you're saying the day is turning when the day is already long on, and it doesn't make sense. You need to say it when the day is actually turning. Now comes the Taz, and the Taz actually makes an interesting point. The Taz says that you see that the Python actually held like Rabbi Yochanan, because the Python held that when we're saying this line in Shemona Esrei, we're in the middle of saying Hayom Yifna. He can't imagine. If the Python would have imagined that maybe you'd end up lying to Hashem, then he wouldn't put on a line Hayom Yifna. It sounds nice, but the Python is he's not going to have you saying things that don't make sense in front of Hashem. So the Python must have held that you are only going to be davening Shemona Esrei before Tzeis, and therefore it makes sense to say Hayom Yifna. That says the Taz. Ultimately comes to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch says Hayom Yifna. It's you're supposed to try to say it before it says. If you don't, then it's fine. Practically speaking, I can't say that I know for a fact what the custom of the Baba Shuls are, but I think that nowadays everyone is hungry. And so as far as the sensibilities of how long to schlep out davening for and other parts of Yom Kippur, I think that maybe people don't mind schlepping it out too much. But in a practical sense, most of the time is going to be something 1:45, 2 o'clock, something like that to finish at least the Quiet Shemona Esrei. So you don't really run into these problems of schlepping things out too long. Maybe Rosh Hashanah, I don't know, but I can't say that I know what the minhag on the ground is. Ultimately, though, the Alter Rebbe says also that this piece of Hayom Yifna, if ultimately you're after Tzeis, you still say it. So we have an interesting kind of idea where we see that Paitanim are trying to stick ideas of Torah and halacha in, and now whether or not they're trying to stick in ideas to halacha, but you see from what they're doing. We had in Siman Samach, we had the idea that they put in a piyutim that in itself tells you that they're able to have piyutim. You have the idea of what time davening should be had, and you have you have the idea of talking to malachim, which is the fact that anyone made such a piyut. Chaim Volozhin said from the day that he stood on his das, he didn't say anything like that because he held his pashut. It's not allowed. So you see that Paitanim are really having a conversation in the game without writing a sefer of halacha, without writing anything else. They have their idea. Now, just to be clear, also, you have other ideas. I mean, not just to be clear, I'm talking about other ideas. I don't want to go for too long in this idea. I am, as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, in a little bit of a time crunch. But you have also the Seder of Avodah is a concept where you have piyutim that have halachic ramification. You have an idea of what interposing avodah should you have in between the lighting of 5 candles of the menorah, or that is say the hatava of 5 candles of the menorah and the hatava of the light of 2 candles, and that is paskin in the Seder of Avodah. We paskin like Abaya, even though seemingly we shouldn't be paskening, or at least that's what it says in the piyut, and the Rebbe actually has a beer on that, but in Kam Mukeme. You have the Seder Korban Pesach, is something that the Rebbe actually discusses, Siddur Yavis discusses, as the Rebbe notes, and he gives his edits, his answers for the questions of the Yavitz. You have Yetzeres, or I should say Krevises, for all of the Dalet Parshias, and you have essentially an Erev Pesach Drasha that's in the Krevis for the Shabbos HaGadol, and so you have the idea that Paitanim are not just trying to tell you a piece of information, they're not just trying to give you a poem, they're trying to tell you a piece of information in their poetry. Essentially what it seems to be is that when a Paitan gives an idea over through a piyut, if we trust the guy, or not even if we trust, I'll get to trust the guy, but if we trust the guy, certainly we'll say that this guy is giving over a certain piece of information. Because we trust him, we're going to take it at face value that everything is accurate. So if he says something in his piyut, we're going to say that this is taka, something reliable. But it goes beyond that, and that's really the main point that I was trying to bring out. It goes beyond that when you have everyone that's discussing piyutim, you have people and they're sitting in shul, they know all of the lines, they know what's going on, and they hear the chazan saying things. And you have so many little instances where people say, oh, you're saying Hayom Yifna when it's after Seis, we got to mention that in our chibur. We need to have a conversation about it. You can't just get away with saying Hayom Yifna when it's after Seis. So when you have that kind of thing, it seems to turn out that any piyut that might have been rejected would have been rejected at this point. So if you're living in the generation of the Alter Rebbe and you have a piyut, and the piyut is Iggeres Hakodesh, which, by the way, funnily enough, I think is actually right after that piyut from Rashi. I think like the piyut immediately after that. But you have Iggeres Hakodesh, and not Iggeres Hakodesh. You have Atu Elokeinu Hashmayim V'Aretz. So that's what I meant to say. Atu Elokeinu. You have the piyut of Atu Elokeinu, and you say the line of Levush Tzedakah, and everyone's been hearing this in shul, and no one protested this idea. No one said, there's only Levush Tzedakah. Actually, he's Matmakil Kina, which another line from there. But you have Kavi Shua Bereshe. No one is commenting like this. So you see from this that it's actually become accepted. When every Rishon heard that line being said in Shul, not necessarily every Rishon, but when a very large amount of Rishonim heard that line being said in Shul, that in itself gives it a certain kind of weight. Lahar, I'm not sure if I mentioned it in this one, but I think I mentioned in this series of shiurim vis-a-vis the Meir Nevuchim about the translation that while there is an argument to be made for studying the translation for studying Meir Nevuchim in the original Arabic without a translation, at the same time, most of the Rishonim and Achronim only had access to the Meir Nevuchim as a translation, and that is the book that became, wow, this is a book that either you love or you hate, but ultimately that became the book that was known. That is the book under discussion, the translated book. And to a certain extent, I think that it's the same thing with Piyutim, that a poem here or a poem there is not necessarily something that we're going to start quoting in Torah. But when all of the Rishonim are hearing it being said in the middle of Shemona Esrei and they're not protesting, when they protest so much, that means that it's a line to be quoted. So now that we're here, I want to just posit a few ideas. Hopefully not too many ideas, but just a couple of what might be going on in the Alter Rebbe's line. So I'm going to try to give 3 ideas. The first one is that if you want to say V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian, it leaves too much shakiness to actually be taken seriously. When the Alter Rebbe has a whole other chapter about V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian, chapter 3 of Iggeres Hakodesh, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it's not that the Alter Rebbe has it per se, but it's that it's in Iggeres Hakodesh. It's a letter of the Alter Rebbe. And the Rebbe actually references over here to look over there. You have a similar notion to some extent. The thing is that firstly, the phraseology of V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian in and of itself implies that it's not a constant thing. Right now, what we're trying to say is that constantly, the main levush that you get in touch with Hashem with is tzedakah. To say V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian implies that it's a thing. Sometimes he wears it, sometimes he doesn't. Now he garbs himself with righteousness, with tzedakah, but it's not a constant thing. You also have the point that V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian is one levush in a whole list of levushim. He has a Kaveh Yeshua, he has a Kina, he has an Akama, so he has all these midas that he's enclosing himself with. So in theory, you would say, if you're trying to bring out a proof from this, then I would say, okay, well, tzedakah is a levush that you can have. You also have Yeshua, so some kind of hamshachis, and you have zealousy, and you have all of these other things. So ultimately, the point kind of gets lost. I mean, even the next words in the pasuk, Kaveh Yeshua, and that's actually quoted in chapter 3. And ultimately, when we look at chapter 3 and we look at the drasha the Alter Rebbe has about V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian, it actually seems to be that it's impossible to start quoting that over here to bring out our point. The reason is because V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian is actually about stopping Hamshacha from coming down in a negative way. And this is fully discussed in chapter 3, and as the Rebbe encourages, I also encourage that you should go study chapter 3. But in short, what the Alter Rebbe says over there is that the same way that you have scales and each little scale stops whatever might be hitting at that particular location, the same way, when you have Hamshachas coming down, you want to have tzedakah. Every little mitzvah that you do stops that Hamshacha shouldn't go to the wrong place. So that part doesn't really apply over here, where what we're trying to bring out is not about Hamshachas. We're trying to bring out, this is the vessel for appreciating Hashem, ultimately when Mashiach comes. A completely different vart from V'yil b'tzedakah k'Syrian. So that's one idea for why we should be saying Levush Tzedakah. Then you have another idea, which is that there's a letter that Alter Rebbe references. Remember I said at the beginning, the letter of Ishtakad. So there's another letter that the Alter Rebbe mentions, and you could argue that this fits better with the general theme of that letter, and that this is a continuation of that letter. Now, that letter is printed in the letters of the Alter Rebbe. There's a compilation that they put out. I don't know that we have every letter of the Alter Rebbe, but it is published over there, if I'm not mistaken, in the 101st letter. This is actually printed over there as the 102nd letter, as in this chapter of Iggeres Hakodesh, chapter 32. So, over there in that letter, it's discussing the idea of Rechavim Mitzvahs Chama, similar concept to what we're discussing over here to some extent, but essentially that, you have the mitzvah tzedakah, and Rechavim Mitzvahs Chama refers to the mitzvah tzedakah because it is what enables us that we're able to properly appreciate Hashem. And so when you're continuing from that letter, it seems to be that this idea of Levush Tzedakah is more fitting to the idea, because we're talking about one singular mitzvah. We're not talking about a whole multitude, similar to the last idea, but I just wanted to present it in a slightly different way. And then the third thing is a little bit more basic to a certain extent. But once we have these two ideas, we can maybe put them together to come to a third idea, which is that in that last letter, the Alter Rebbe actually does parenthetically mention the idea of levush tzedakah. He says, as the Python says, levush tzedakah. So this was a throwaway mention, I think, that the Alter Rebbe put into his letter. Now, it's possible that I got back to the Alter Rebbe, people either didn't know where it says, because the Alter Rebbe didn't say, I need to rephrase myself. The Alter Rebbe didn't say the Python says. The Alter Rebbe said that as it says, levush tzedakah. It's possible that people were looking through Tanakh and they didn't remember where it says levush tzedakah. But you could imagine a phrase like levush tzedakah would appear somewhere in Tanakh and that you might just be missing it. So ultimately, people might have written to the Alter Rebbe saying, we looked for this line, levush tzedakah, and we're not familiar with where it is. People might have written back Ares, and it's possible that this follow-up letter was actually that the Alter Rebbe was writing back to them in part to answer some questions that came in. I don't know that this is the case. It's possible in theory. Or the Alter Rebbe might have just felt that he gave it as a throwaway mention and he wanted to expand more upon it. So ultimately, it's possible the Alter Rebbe didn't even mean too much of it in the first letter, notwithstanding the point that all of his words are very, very perfect, as we see that the idea of levush tzedakah fits much better than levush tzedakah kisiryan. By the way, I keep on saying kisiryan, I think there's different precise. It might be kisiryan, but ultimately the point is that the Alter Rebbe over here is continuing from that letter, and so to expand on this parenthetical mention of levush tzedakah, he says that, as the Python says, levush tzedakah. If I had to say a lesson from this idea, because I do want to bring out a lesson, it's that when we say davening, we should be actually cognizant that even the parts which seem poetic, and the parts which seem to be a lot, there's a whole idea that people don't really like paying attention to piyutim, and arguably for good reason, as we said in Simon Samachas, the Alter Rebbe wasn't such a fan of the at least the piyutim of Kriyashma. B'chlal Rishonim weren't such a fan of the piyutim of Kriyashma, Rishonim and Achronim, because it's a breeding ground for talking in the middle of davening, and it's also, even in the middle of Shemar Esrei, it's to a certain extent a breeding ground for talking in the middle of davening. Ultimately, we do say whatever it is that we say. We say much less than we could be saying, but it still feels to be a lot. The entire Yom Kippur is taken up. The first half of Rosh Hashanah is taken up with piyutim, and there's a lot of piyutim. Ultimately, though, there's a lot to be gleaned from it. Anything that survived the ages through being repeated in the ears of Rishonim for so long is something that we should treasure and that we should appreciate. We should be medayik in, and we should darshan in. And ultimately, every piyut is something from, I'm not going to say every piyut, but at least piyutim like from the Kaliri, piyutim from days of Rishonim, are opinions of Rishonim about how we relate to Hashem in davening, and we should take that to heart and we should appreciate it. So, l'chaim.